Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time here in the US on the East Coast. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., and we're gonna get started with our Saturday stream, where we're going to look into MLOps and software development and machine learning and .NET and the things we usually do at this hour. Let's get situated here. Let's get the microphone in a good place. I hope you can hear me well. I hope you have your coffee or tea ready. I've already had my first coffee this morning, so I'm going to go some water at this point and get things going. I hope you all had a great week so far. It's been a quite a hectic week for me, honestly, but super fun. On Wednesday evening, me, Bree, Louise, and John, we set forth the full night ML.NET workshop at NSC Melbourne, which was fantastically fun. We had a great time, and we were able to kind of just exercise the material we had created before that, so that's really fun. Hopefully we can actually run that workshop on a stream soon again, or something similar, because it has some really cool content, honestly, especially the later part when we talk about MLOps, and Luis did some really cool stuff when it comes to deep learning and object detection, so hopefully we'll get that to you soon. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. I don't have a speaking engagement until the end of August now, which is kind of nice, taking a little break here, get some rest at the end of the summer. Have actually a day off today and yesterday and Thursday, and taking 2 more days next week, so it's gonna be nice to get some rest. But doesn't stop me from looking into MLOps.NET and then having fun with that. We had some really good successes, honestly, last week and the last few days with MLOps.NET. Just getting some things more stable and situated, which has been fun. One thing that we have started doing now as well is the release cycle. So one thing that was done last week was that I bumped up the version numbers here to actually have the fixed number instead of having the build number itself as a third digit, and then putting the build number instead as a suffix here, which makes it a bit easier for us to control those things when we put them into GitHub. So currently we're working on the 0.3.1 release here. And just if someone is interested here, we added a workflow called Release NuGet. And this one here is actually triggered automatically when we do a release. So if you go into, I'm not sure how familiar we are with releases in GitHub, so we'll walk through that just because I think it's really cool. If you create a release here, for example the 0.3.1, you can do that by just drafting a release. You'll get the ability to add some release notes to that release and so forth. And once you create that release, we'll actually kick off this GitHub workflow directly. And what it will do is it will package our packages for us with a version, and it will release that and push that to NuGet directly. So you can see here, we'll publish the MLOps.NET package, and we'll use this GitHub action here with a NuGet API key, and we'll push that straight to our repository. So that would make the whole process of releasing our packages automatic, instead of having to build them and copy them locally, log into NuGet.org, upload them, all that stuff, which is nice. So we should be able to release much more often, maybe even every stream, honestly, when we get something that we want to deploy. When it comes to the roadmap of this tool, because that's something I think about quite a bit here, when are we going to get out of the beta state? Well, my thought is that once we have this deployment scenario for one type of deployment, for example, I think file deployment sorted out, I think we're good to go to a non-beta version. One thing we need to figure out as well before we go there, though, is the migration policy for our metadata store, which we'll, I think, figure it out. We just need to be able to add migrations and update the data model for whoever consumes our package here. But we'll get there. Cool. All right. So what are we going to do today? What do you all want to do today? Who do we have on the stream today, and what are you in the mood for? I have some thoughts, but I want to hear what you have to say. So definitely dump it in the chat or wherever else you want to do it. And while you do that, I'm going to bring up this diagram here to explore a bit what we have done so far. So the last couple of streams here, what we have actually done here is that we have created a run artifact table and a registered model table here as well to be able to deploy our models successfully. What I want to do now is make sure that we can deploy a model in a way that we expose it to a consuming application. And I think the easiest way of doing that is having a file deploy scenario. So if you worked with MLOps before or kind of know how to consume these models, there's multiple ways of doing that, right? But the simplest way, well actually the next simplest way, is to do from URI. You can do from file path if you embed it locally into your application and those stuff. But that makes it difficult to change, because then you need to have the same release cycle for your model as you have for your application, which is not always preferable. So from URI is a really cool way of doing it, because you can have your model on a blob storage container and you can just expose that model publicly or whatever authentication you want there, and you'll then be able to just consume that from that URL. So I think that's the easiest way of doing it, and that's what I want to do. So a couple of things I looked at before here. I don't think we need to worry about this right now, but what I want to do today is create a deployment target just to be able to specify that, and I think for our scenario it's going to be super simple. And I want to create a deployment here, and what I want us to do here, and I'll just kind of jot down some thoughts here because I think it makes it easier to understand here. I want to create at least 2 methods, and we'll probably get more eventually, but we need something called create deployment target, right? And the idea here behind the deployment target is that so we can specify like a test environment and a production environment and a stage environment or whatever you want to expose your model on. And it's not going to have much more than a name, honestly. It's going to be pretty simple, but it's going to be maybe a name, and that's kind of it, I think. Maybe deployment type. And honestly, I think right now we can do is what I wanted to support right now is a local file deployment, and I want to support file deployment. So it's going to be local or in the cloud. And later, maybe we want to support a container deployment of some sort here. But we're going to keep it simple. We're going to assume this is file deployment for now, and we'll refactor it when we get the need for anything else here. So name here can be, for example, it could be the type of deployment, right? So we need that, and eventually we'll have a created date here as well and other stuff. So a deployment, for example, what can a deployment target be? So if you look at the deployment target model, we need an ID, right? We need a name, which is going to be what we create here. We'll need a deployment type, and for now it's going to be file only, but eventually we probably also want container here. And eventually I think as well we need a list of deployments here as well that has taken place, so we can keep track of that. Cool. So that's going to be just creating that deployment location. And then after that we need to have a method for deploy model, right? And that's going to take a deployment target. It's going to take a registered model that we've done before, right? And it's going to more or less copy our model from our model repository to our deployment targets and expose it through URI. And it needs to be public deployment target. And this will create a deployment table row, I think. So we need to have some kind of storage of that information, right? So I think that will have an ID. It will probably have a deployment target ID, registered model ID, so we can fetch the experiments, deployment time, and maybe deployed by. So if we can get this created in some way today, I think that'll be pretty awesome. It will give us some kind of a way, I think, to expose the model to the world. And this should be deployed model. And in some way we need to be able to also say the URI to this one, so we'll look at that. But let's get started, I think, and start with this. and then depending on how we feel about that, we'll change that and we'll get the deployed model ready as well. Cool. Does that sound good to everyone on the stream today? Does anyone have any other thoughts or ideas or ways you want to do this differently? Let me know. Alright, so as usual, per usual, I think it's best is to start from the top to understand how we're going to call this method, and then we'll trickle down in the back here and figure out where to put it, which repository, and those kind of things here. And to do that, we'll go into our catalogs here and understand where we want to put it. So we have these data catalog, relation catalog, lifecycle catalog, model catalog, and training catalog. I feel like it makes most sense to do it in the model catalog because we're going to manipulate it there. I don't think we need a new one for this, and we already have these register models here and those kind of stuff here. So I think it makes sense to do that here. Actually, when it comes to deployment targets, does it make sense to have it there or a new catalog? I guess what we can do is put it into our model catalog first. Actually, let's create a new catalog here. I think we need a new catalog for deployment. That probably makes more sense, at least, because we need to create a deployment target and those things. So let's do that. I want to keep it a little bit clean here. So, because we will probably look at deployment once we start searching for this, right? So we'll do a deployment catalog here. Hey Adam, good to have you on the stream this morning. How you doing? Having a good weekend so far? Okay, deployment catalog. Good to have you on. Good. So this morning I was actually trying to be more handy. I've been trying to do some house projects. And I was trying to fix our bird feeder that the squirrels killed. And I realized I'm much better at software engineering than I'm on practical things, because I sprayed wood glue everywhere, which was awful. But it was fun. Trying to do some repainting in here at home, get some stuff done. Alright, so we have a deployment catalog, right? And the first thing we want to do here is have a method for create deployment targets. And this will have a name, and we'll look into this stuff later. Wow, awesome. Well, Adam, I was off Friday, Thursday this week, and off 2 days next week. So I'm gonna try to do some more hands-on stuff outside to be more handy. We'll see how that goes. I'm not sure. All right, so create a deployment target here. Yeah, I think I'll need that. So that's probably going to be our signature for deployment target, I think. So the question now is, what kind of repository in the backend do we want this to end up in, right? So we have our storage and we have our repositories here. So we have different kind of repositories for different entities, and I feel like we should have more of a generic repository here for deployment. Either we do a deployment repository or we do a deployment target repository. That probably makes more sense here. Deployment target. I think a deployment repository makes sense, and we'll kind of group deployment related entities in that repository. Any objections? Going once, going twice. I'm at the keyboard, so I'll win otherwise. Alright. I think we'll do a deployment repository. And let's see, do we need to make it public? I don't think we should do that. Oh, apparently it is, okay. Alright, so let's make sure we match stuff here. Okay, so we need an interface as well, right? As we always do here. Deployment repository. Okay. That is gone. Perfect. I'm getting so close now of getting a public release here. I'm really excited. I want want to get it out, I want to get it reliable and usable for sure. But I also want to make sure it's solid with tests and it makes sense. Get this going. Deployment repo here, right? Perfect. Alright, so we'll add this comment here and say this is try to make sure we match whatever it says here. I like to be consistent with these things. Repository to manage deployment related entities. Okay, so right here we'll lead a method for creating a deployment target, right? Just like we did in our catalog. Name. Deployment target name. Let's make sure it's explicit here. Creates a deployment target. Okay. And we'll make sure we get that implemented here in the repository and figure out what else we want to do here, right? So deployment repository, got that going. We'll create a constructor because I think we'll need that. Create this method that we just had interface for. And let's understand here what we need. I think we need a context factory here so we can access the database, right? As always. Go and make sure we don't do a typo right there. Good stuff. So anyone has any fun plans for the weekend? What are you all doing after seeing this stream? Are you going outside, getting some fresh air? Anyone doing any traveling? Any vacation plans? I need inspiration of what to do with any free time I have here. Okay, let's see. Field, perfect. Nice. Where do you go, Adam? Close by or further south? Okay. Oh, nice. Okay, pretty close. That's awesome. Maybe I'll do that at some point. Alright, so we have the piping done here for the database. So what we need to do now is actually create an entity here to understand how that's going to look like. Because we have the repo and we have the catalog set up, we can also pipe in the stuff here. You should do it. I feel like I spent every week in the last few months here to just fix for conferences, which has been super fun. But I actually don't have a talk for the next 4 or 5 weeks, so I'm going to take a break from all that. Okay. What's your talk about? Adam, anything new or a talk you've done a few times? Constructor, okay. So it's going to be, oh, exciting. You get so nifty titles. I'm envious. I'm the worst with titles. Okay. Deployment target name. Let's make sure we keep this up to date here. Okay, so we got that. Now we have to register this one, make sure we don't forget that. So if you look at these addresses, are done. Oh, nice, okay. Are you submitting it to conference, Adam, or have you already done that and you're prepping it to be given as well? wire this up. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna add this up here. Okay. Sounds fun, Adam. Good luck. Deployment catalog. So we'll add a new one here, deployment. And we will make sure to wire this up here. Sounds good, Brad. Have a good day. Thanks for the support so far. Alright. Enjoy the outdoors. Okay, so we got that settled. Now we're going to make sure we wire it all the way up. Yeah, Brad is awesome. He is in the UK and he is very good at helping out. Well, it's good to get some exercise, right? I'm doing this after this stream. I'm going to do house projects for the rest of the day. So you go get it. Go get it done. Alright. Operations related to model. Okay, so we got that. I'm happy with that. Now let's go do entities. We have piped everything down, right? So from where this is the actual user context that the user is going to see, and now they can pipe it all the way down to create a deployment target that we want to do. So what we need to do now is create entities. So we need to create an entity for this deployment targets. So we'll go and do that here, entities, and we'll go ahead and create a deployment target. And that's going to be called, guess what? Deployment target. And this is going to be public sealed class, yep. And make sure we entity describing. Okay. So what do we want here, right? So we talked about that before. We wanted a couple of properties here, and if you think of any other ones, definitely just shout it out here, because I do want to make sure we add things that make sense. But definitely what we need is an ID, and that's currently been done by using a GUID. We've also want a name here, so that's something we want to make sure we add. And we also want to have here a date time, right? So you want a created date. When did we create this deployment targets? We wanted deployment type here. And do we care about that right now? I'm not sure. There's only one type of deployment. So I'm actually gonna skip this because I am a sucker for keep it simple. When we need deployment type, we'll add that, and it's going to be, you know, different container stuff. But we may actually just change that later, so we'll do that. We'll add one more property here in a bit, which is deployments. But let's go ahead and start with this first. Created date, right? So that's going to be kind of what we need right now. Okay. And I don't think we need anything else, right? It's not going to be tied to an experiment. It's not tied to a model yet. It's not tied to anything. The only no, it's okay. The only thing I wanted to highlight here as well is that I'm making one assumption when doing this, and that is that when you deploy a model for file deployment, you are bound to deploy it to the same storage provider that we have configured in the beginning, which is going to be, you know, either Azure, AWS, or local. So that means you can't have your model repository in a different place than when you deploy your models, which I think is in 99% of cases. That's what you want to do. So I'm going to keep it simple and not complicate this more than we need to. So we're going to assume the same connection strings for the deployment repository as for the model repository. It will make sense in a bit. And the final thing we need to do here is, usually what we've done so far is to have just get this set to here as well if you need something. We'll go ahead and create an ID here. We'll call this GUID here. And we can also set the name directly here, honestly, because that's easy. Okay, great. So now we can go back to the repository here to make sure we add this and get that wired up. I got water everywhere on my desk, so sorry about doing stuff with my hands here. Apparently I'm a poor drinker. At least water. Alright, so we got this context here, and that is awesome. So this should be pretty straightforward. Actually, before we go in back here, oh, it's fine, let's do this first. What we'll do here is we'll create a context, and that'll be var db new this context factory create db context. So that'll open up a context to our database so we can access it. And what we'll do then is create an entity, right? So we'll create a deployment target here, and this is going to be a new deployment target with deployment target name. And honestly, what we can do here, we honestly don't need to set anything else here. By default, sorry, wrong button here. By default, we want to set this created date here to whatever we created this one. So that's what we'll do here as well. Actually, we can't do that. Let me tell you why, because we can't test that. In here, we need an iClock reference, which is our implementation of datetime. And the reason we want to do that is because we want this UTC now to be set everywhere, so we can also mock this and unit test it. So we'll pass one of these in here, and we'll make a proper initializer here, and the created dates clock UTC now, like that. And like that, that's kind of mocked away, and we can then unit test this to make sure we set it to the correct time, and always use UTC times here. Great, all right. So we can't yet add it to the context because we don't have it on a context. That's an issue, so we have to fix that. So we have to go to our DB context to add this as a property, and we'll do that in the database here, MLOps DB context, and you see that we have these context entities here. So what we'll go ahead and do is add a new one called public DB set deployment target. Okay, like that, and we'll make sure we use the same documentation as it's from the interface, and we'll go ahead and add this to the interface. Perfect. So one thing we need to do here, so now we have that on the database, so when we run migrations, that should be added, but we also need to wire this up properly to understand what it has. And one thing that I want to do here, we'll do this in a general one, because actually, yeah, do this in the general one here, is that for the specific one here, model builder, so this is Entity Framework Core we're using, right? To just configure our relationships here, we'll say that deployment target has property. Can we do this? Name is required. I just want to make sure that the name is required here. We don't want to leave that out. And we probably should have done better on our other models here. We'll go back to that later, but that's a good one to start with. So apart from this, we do have 3 different providers here for our Entity Framework Core. We use SQLite for local deployments if you want to. We use SQL Server for those who want to use that. We also use Cosmos DB, which is a non-SQL implementation. So to support that, what we do here is actually pass in an action here in a constructor. So an action here using some functional programming to wire up our entity configuration here, depending on if it's a NoSQL or a SQL relational. So what we need to do here is specify how we're going to treat this deployment target. Is it going to go to a table? Is it going to go to a container? And how is that going to look like? So we can do that pretty quickly. I'll start to find where I wire that up. Here's the implementation for the SQL run, right? So what we'll do here is we'll wire this up to table, and we want to go to the singular version of this entity, like that. So that's all we need to do for our SQL relational implementation. That's going to be used for SQLite and SQL Server. And for our Cosmos DB, we can go to our Azure package here and do our Cosmos entity configurator and add that here. And instead of to table, it's going to go to container because it's not owned by anything. It's by itself here. Clean it up a little bit. Nice. Okay, so by doing that, it's going to expose methods here in the DB. So we can do db.deployment targets here, add, and deployment targets, and then we'll just do await. Always forget this is an async method. Oh, Jesus. The reason why I'm upset because I have to change my signatures here. It's like I always forget this. Alright, it's going to return a task here. Let's go into, I have to change the name. Add a namespace for this one so we can find that. Great stuff. Great success, as Borat would say. Alright, so we have to also make sure we get that method as called in this one. Okay. Yep, please use that. We'll await this one. Clean this up a bit. Okay, so let's see, what are we forgetting here? I think that's good, go straight there. Do we have this? We'll change the name on this one as well. And I think that's gonna be good. The last thing here is we need the deployment repository to be set correctly, and I think we're missing a clock one over here right now. And that is probably here. And right now we're not passing this in yet, so we need to do that. And we need to set this here. Deployment repository. I know it's a lot of piping right now, but it's what we do when we do a new repository or a new just in general, to make sure it's separated properly, and I'm fairly happy with that. It is what it is. We need some DI set up here for sure pretty soon. That's probably going to be a next thing to add here to this. All right. So let's see if this builds. In general right now, this should be enough for creating a deployment target. And what we'll do now is we're going to add a get deployment target method, which is going to be super simple. And then we're going to add some integration tests to make sure that's working. And then after that, we can look at deployments. And I think, honestly, it's not so slow. We worked on this for 25 minutes and we at least gone all the way through more or less here. Which is not too bad, I think. Could be worse. Okay. So one thing we need here for our unit or integration tests, or just in general, is going to be list here deployment targets. To get deployment targets. I think we'll just do all of them because I think that makes sense. They're not tied to anything yet, so it's all good. So we'll get the context here to fetch those. Context factory, create DB context, and then what we'll do is just return DB deployment targets. And we'll do it to list here, because otherwise it's not going to work, because we lose our DB context of this method. It's going to get exposed, so we need to make sure we do that. And this needs the proper documentation as well. Should be good. And we need to wire this up in the interface, and then let's go ahead and add some integration tests after that. Okay, gets all deployment targets. Who would have thought? That's what it does. I would have thought that. Okay, good. So let's look at integration tests now. Let's go ahead and minimize this a bit. So we need to add integration tests for this. So if you go to our test folder here, you know we have quite a bit of stuff here. And we're going to go straight to our integration tests here. And we have them separated by catalogs, so we need to make sure we add one for our deployment catalog as well. And I think we can just copy paste a small one, honestly, to get the what do we need here in general. Let's go ahead and add a simple one. It's fine. So we'll say it's going to be deployment catalog tests, right? And it's going to be a public class. I think it's going to inherit from this one. I think so. Yeah, I think we need to inherit from this one to get that working. So we'll do repository tests. And the reason why we're doing this again is because we want the same test to run on each different environment that we have automatically. This really helps with that. And in your repository test here, we want to clean up deployment targets. And honestly, I'm going to do a little cleanup myself here, because this is a little bit too verbose here. Can I just do that? Oh, sorry, move range. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit easier. And we'll do context dot, and just make this a bit less verbose here. Because I feel like I trust this enough now to know what it's doing. Okay. Great, a little bit less verbose, always good. Alright, so we got that. We got the deployment catalog test here, and let's see what else do we need to get here. We need to get some methods. Okay, so we can add tests here directly. Perfect. Alright, so what kind of methods do we want to add here? Well, first we need a test method set up here, right? For that. Nice, just adds it directly. So the method we're testing is create deployment targets, right? Given name creates valid deployment targets. That's gonna be one method we want to create, right? And then we also want to check that if we don't set a name, we should not be very happy. So create deployment targets given name is null or empty, throws exception with message. So we should probably implement that as well to make sure we have a check for that, and that should be properly safeguarded. I think that's all we need to do right now. So let's get this set up here, and in a specific scenario here, let's see, we need to, I think everything is set up for us, honestly. It's so sweet. I love this. I love how simple this is to create tests for this now. Sorry for being bragging here, but I just really like how easy this is. Okay, in our case here, given a name, so name, well, let's give it a name, test. Let's call it production to be exciting. And this is a sync, so we need to change this as well. Alright, perfect. So given that we've done that, we should be able to go ahead and fetch that as well here. Deployment targets. Deployment. Oh, and we need to add that method as well to our context here. So we'll get and do that. So we'll say public async task. Actually, no task. List deployment targets. We probably need that in the UI later. That's why I'm adding it. Targets. Okay, right. Get deployment targets. No misspellings today so far. Okay, that's good. And then we'll just go ahead and return this deployment repository. Get. There you go. So we got that crude operation there, more or less set up. And don't need to be async. All right, back to the test here. Now we can get deployment targets here. Get the deployment targets, just like that. And what we want to verify here is that we only have one. Well, we don't need to verify that really, but we'll go ahead and say that the first one here, the name should, and we'll use fluid assertions here for this. It's our method. Should be, come on, be nice, production. And let's see why it's not happy. There we go. So that's good. So that's going to test that. And we can't test the time right now because it's going to be the exact time it's going to work, but we can at least test the date here to make sure that that's properly working. So we'll say that created date, and we'll do the date part of that. Should be daytime now. Date. It should be today's date, which is good. Okay. We'll run that in a bit here. We don't need the range anymore. Okay. So what we need to test as well here is that if we run this with like null or something like that. Test case, right? Can we do that? Okay. Let's do test method here. What is the test case equivalent here in Microsoft's version here? Test case in MS test. Test class. Okay, data row. Is that it, really? That sounds fun. Okay, let's skip that for now. Okay, so we got that going. Let's just do null for now, that's fine. So here we are expecting let's see, sync task. So here we are actually expecting exception, right? Sounds good, Adam. Have fun. Thank you for joining in a bit. Expected exception, right? That should be type of argument null exception I want, and I want the message here to be let's call this, let's see, no deployment target name specified. Required deployment target name is not specified. Okay. Perfect. So now we need to add that kind of validation somewhere. And we can either do that here, or we can do it in a repository. And I think so far we've done it here mostly, because that's kind of where it's living. So we can do that real quick here. We'll check that before we even create a context. So if deployment target name is null or empty, we'll just throw a new argument null. And we'll say, where did my text go? We want it to be this. Honestly, I don't need this. The dot is kind of too much. Okay. Let's do something in deployment. Sorry, that was specified. That's, I think, simple enough. Alright, so let's go ahead and run these tests. And before we do that, let's go ahead and remove the database locally here. So open up SQL Server Management Student here. And I'll go ahead and dump that database, make sure that works. And we'll see how we get going here. That would be fun. Hope you're having a good day so far. I think I need to start my container as well, that's why it's complaining. Because, well, it's going to complain in just a bit. So let me open Visual Studio Code here on the side and get my container spun up so we can connect to it. So I'm running my SQL Server in a container. So if you want to do this locally, you don't need to install SQL Server. You can just spin up a container with it and connect to it like this. And let's go ahead and start this one and give that a moment before we try it again. Hopefully that's going to be sufficient. Let's see. Does it make sense so far for everyone? Does anyone have any questions, any ideas, anything they want to do instead? Or are we good so far? Here we go. If so, you're always welcome to jot them down and let me know. Alright, so what we're going to do is clean up this database, get a fresh one here, delete. And let's go ahead and run these tests now. So let's go ahead and build them and let's run them for SQL Server. If they work, we'll go ahead and run them for our Cosmos DB implementation, and that's going to be a good tell if this is working as expected. And I think I should create a unit test as well, just to make sure that that's also properly done here. Me as well. Okay, so Test Explorer here, and let's go ahead and see if we can find this test that we need to run here. Come on. Oh, I'm showing those, that's why. Okay, SQL Server, perfect. And I'm a little bit surprised I don't have my new tests here, so I may have missed something with spinning it just up here. Did I miss something for implementations or what? I think I may have missed something for my implementations. SQL Server. I think you just need to add a test here. Yep, okay. Sorry for that. We need to add one kind of general class here to get this going. So we'll call this, and this should be fast. This is going to be deployment, catalog tests, deployment, and they will be running deployment tests. Okay, that is all I need for my SQL Server part. We'll do the same for SQLite here. Make sure that's wired up. Deployment, catalog tests. Yep. Okay, what is... Oh, it's no CSSY. Can't find IntelliSense. Okay. And then finally we're going to do the same thing for Azure, and that should be enough. Okay. And then we do the same thing for Azure. I feel like I missed some tests here. I have to check that later. This one should have some more, I think. Okay, there we go. Let's build this again. Let's run these tests now and make sure this works. I think it should be pretty good right now, I think. Hopefully. Oh, I'm sore after painting yesterday. I was painting a whole day in the stairway and getting some trim work done. And I definitely feel it in my body right now. Let's see how this works. Did I miss something? Or did I get everything right the first time? That would be a first. Look at that, they passed. Let's manually verify, because trust but verify, right? Refresh. We should have a deployment target table here now. We do, so that's good. And hopefully this should be properly configured, so we should have not null and name. Yeah, that looks good. Let's run these for Azure, and if that's good, then I think we are pretty close on getting this section done here. Make sure it works for our NoSQL implementation as well as for our SQL implementation. Bum, 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 bum. There it works. Alright, so let's go ahead and do one more thing, which is add a unit test that we need to add for the date, and then we'll push a branch for this. And I'm going to show you how that was done. I think we had unit tests here, and I think we had, can't remember what I added before, but it was a run repository test. Yep, this is the one. So we need to add one just for the deployment scenario here to make sure we set the time correctly, and we'll just copy paste this one, it'll be quick. And I will call this deployment repository test. And I'm adding them right now because I will add them otherwise later, and we may as well just go ahead and do that right now. And this is called model catalog test. I don't want that. We have to change that later. Deployment repository test. Okay. So what we do here is go ahead and clean this up and add what we care about, which is going to be just one method, I think. So it's going to be create deployment target should set created date, right? And here we're going to call this deployment repository. And we are going to pass in the same things. A little bit surprised here. Okay. I have to clean up the other one, I think, later, because we may need that. So we're using an Entity Framework core feature here called memory database. So it's actually a unit test against the memory database here instead, but it's really cool. So we don't need any of that. We do need to have our clock mock here. So our clock is going to return our data we care about, and we'll do that. We'll call this production. And then we fetch this with DB context, deployment targets. What we want to check here is the created date here. Alright, that should be good. But I also want to clean up some stuff here, because the run repository here is a little bit off. It should be called run repository tests. So that needs to be cleaned up. I don't want it to use direct this one, so I should use the interface. That's better. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our tests here. Somewhere. Okay, let's go ahead and build this, make sure we do that, and then run a unit test, and then I think we're done with the deployment targets part here in less than an hour, which is not too bad. New entity, new piping, all the CRUD operations, 3 storage providers, AWS, Azure, and localhost, and SQL Server. It's not too bad. I think that's a pretty developer efficient operation for sure. Okay, let's run all these. We just need 2 more tests, and then we're over 100 tests, which is pretty cool. All right, that passes. So let's go ahead and find the proper issue for this, and then open a branch for it. And I think that was deployment environment here, and we can probably reduce this one a little bit here. Oop. I'm gonna modify it slightly, because I think we probably want to be a bit simpler first. Deployment. Okay, I thought about deployment environment before. Deployment type. Model name. That's okay. We will modify this now, because we're going in a different route here. Oh. Okay, let's save that. Let's modify this one. And just to give some context here. Okay. Anyway, this is issue 148, so that's going to be what we're going to add. So let's go ahead and add that. So new branch, issue 148. We'll keep it a little bit simpler here, smaller branches, so we can review it easily. So we have the container set up here, we have our catalogs, got the whole piping here. We have that. Some tests. Nice. I like what we've done in this place. Okay. Added support for deployment targets. We'll do added simple support for now. We'll get there later. Hopefully. Okay. Perfect. So let's go ahead and open a PR for this, and then we can go ahead and continue on the deployment piece here. Okay, this fixes 148, right? Simple, fun. Nothing to specify the name of the deployment target, which normally would end being test stage for sample. production, right? That's kind of what it's going to look like, I think. I used us. Alright, let's hopefully this is going to pass. Let's wait for our CI build to run here. And then what we're going to do is just wait for a review, and then we're going to continue on the next part here. But let's make sure this passes so we have done everything properly before we continue. I don't want us to rush through things here. And we see here we kick out our different workflow path here for GitHub Actions. So we have our integration tests for our different environments, and we have some example path and our CI build that runs unit tests and packaging steps and those kind of stuff, right? Looks pretty good so far, I think. Let's wait for that to complete, which is important. And hopefully that should work. Let's go to the checks here. This is the Azure ones running. Let's look at how that's going. So the cool thing here is it's spinning up like a service container for us to run. Unfortunately, we can't run the Cosmos tests here, but we ran them locally and they passed, so that's good. But it's checking the storage container at least for dependencies there, which is good. And I expect this one to pass. Let's look at the other ones though. Convo. Okay, started passing at least, that's good. Got example builds, those are like the, I think we haven't changed anything there, so that's not surprising. The rest are more of my concern. Okay, CI build passes, that's good. So SQLite is good and unit tests are good. And let's see if our SQL Server passes as well. And if so, we'll ask for review. This is like popping a champagne bottle before victory, but I think it will pass. I believe in our implementation there. Deployment. Alright, cool. Well, good job everyone. We have successfully done this one. So now we can ask for a review of this one, and it's quite a lot of files, but that's less than an hour's work, so that's good. And we'll continually starting on the deployment piece here, because now we're actually really close on deploying these things here and making fun of it. Alright, so what are we going to do next? Well, the next thing here we talked about, right, was the fact that we want to create a deployment and the ability to deploy a model with a deployment entity. And what it's going to do is create an input in our table for the deployment. But more importantly, what it's going to do is going to copy that registered model over to a deployment container of sorts with a specific name. So what we'll do again is we're going to go ahead and start from the top here and add the support for that, and then we'll go and add the backend things here. But we have a lot more piping than before now, so it should be good. So what we're going to do is, I think we're going to add it to the deployment catalog here. Now we have that already set up. So we're going to add a method here called deploy public sync task deploy model async, and it's going to take a deployment target and spit it out, come on, and it's going to take a registered model, because that's kind of what we will need. Deploy model sync, that's good. Deploys registered model. That's fine right now. So in the repository here, we need a method for a similar thing here. So we need return this, actually no returns here, just this deployment repository, deploy model sync. So that's going to be what we do first here, right? We're going to do that. We pass in deployment target here. And we're going to pass in the registered model. Let's go and create that interface method real quick here. So that's like number one, right? But that's not all we're going to do here. And why are you complaining? Wait. We also need to worry about actually copying this over, so we need another method as well to be able to do that, and we'll look at it later, but for now I'm just going to set a comment here. So we need to be able to deploy model by copying from model repo to deployment container. That's going to be the general thing I want to do afterwards here, right? But let's go ahead and implement this one here. This is going to be a task because it's an async method, and that's good. Oh, sorry. I thought we had implemented this one already. Oh, what happened with... Oh, it's right there, sorry. Need some space here. Okay, creates deployments. That's fair, I think. And I think actually what I want to do here is create deployment instead. It's better name here because we're not actually deploying it, we're just creating a deployment here. Create deployment async. I think that's a better name because we're not deploying anything, we're doing that in the model itself. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement this in the repo. This should be a fairly easy task. And that can be... Let's do it over here. Actually, let's keep them together, it's fine. Okay, need to have a task on this one. So public sync task. And we're gonna inherit the docs here, just as we did before. Okay, and let's see why you're complaining. Okay, well, we haven't done anything, that's why. Alright, so what are we going to do here? Well, we're going to do first get the DB as we always do, right? So we're going to get that in context factory so we can mark that away properly. And then what we're going to do eventually here at the end here is called DB save changes sync, just to get this warning away. And in between here we're going to create our deployment and deploy it. So we need an entity, so let's go ahead and add an entity for that. And we can do that by going to our interfaces, our entities right here, and we will create a new one here. It's going to be called deployment, right? Deployment. And it's going to be a public seal class. Entity. Describing deployment. Okay. So what do we need here? Well, we need an ID, and I think I call this ID. I don't want to call it ID. I'm going to fix this up here real quick here. Deployment ID. And let me actually push that up to our branch, and then the rest we're going to do a new branch for, but I do want to, if it's possible, do that. Yeah, okay, that's possible without any other changes. Let's do that. This should be next ID here. These are standards, because I like to have them prefixed. It just makes it easier to see. Oh, deployment target ID. Deployment target ID. Do we even have foreign keys here? I think so. Yeah, okay. Okay. Let's push this up. And let's go back to the deployment scenarios here. So, we were adding an entity for deployment, right? And right here we need a GUID. So we need an ID for this entity. And we're going to call this deployment ID. Deployment ID. So what do we need on a deployment here, right? What do we need here? Looks like we need ID and we needed some other stuff here. So We do need a foreign key here in some way to deployment target ID, because that's going to be just in general what it is related to. That means we can also, if you wanted to, you know, do a deployment target here entity. I think that makes sense. If we need that later, who knows? Okay, so we can reference that. It's gonna be good. And then what we need here is we need a registered model. The same thing. And we'll go ahead and add those entities as well. Registered to GUID. Okay. That is good. Do we need any? I'm trying to think. We need an experiment here ID as well, just to get that properly set up. I feel like that's a good thing to do, because what we need eventually here is going to be the name of the experiment as well. Because, like in Azure, for example, when we do our storage containers, we ideally what we don't do, right, is going to have like a folder for each experiment, and under that we're going to have name of deployment targets. So it's going to be test, production, stage, whatever. But when it comes to like a container, it can't really be a hierarchy. It can, but not really. So what we're gonna do there is we're gonna have experiments and then dash the name. So I'm thinking that container names we're gonna create for deployments here are gonna be, for example, experiment name, and then it's going to be dash deployment target name here, just to keep it simple here. So I think we need experiment there as well. Because otherwise we have to go back a lot to fetch that later, which is going to be annoying when we deploy it. Let's think about this a bit here. How are we going to do that? We need to fetch that. Yep. Okay. So when we deploy, we're going to get the deployment target that we want to deploy at. We already have that, so that's good. And then we're going to create a deployment. I don't think we need experiment actually, not at this place here. We may need it for the deployment targets actually. And we can change that later if we wanted to, but I think for that right now that's okay. Things we need though is stuff like datetime, deployment date. And then I think that's good. And then we probably also want to have like a deployed by property here. So we'll do string deployed by. Right, keep that centralized. Okay, that's a good start I think for the entity. So let's go ahead and do that, and let's go ahead and fix that in our repository here. Should be quick. Let's see, deployment, repo, right? Deployment, repository. And that's right here. So deployment equals new deployment. And in here, well, we'll also create a constructor, set the ID, deployment ID, good, okay. Perfect. And we can also create set of times here, so deployed date, it's going to be again, we can't do that, we're going to do that in the other one. Deployed by. We definitely need to pass that in as well here. So we probably need a... This can be, I think, empty. We don't need that all the time. No, we need it all the time. I like to have that. That's important. Let's pipe that up all the way. I think it's important to have some audit trail here. Ideally we do that from users, but let's go ahead and do that. That can be different from the registered it, so that's okay. Deployment catalog here, we'll go ahead and add that here as well. And that as a missing parameter, and then deployed by. Okay. Alright, that's good. Let's go back to the deployment repo. Let's pin this so it's easy to find. And then what we'll do here is add times here, so it's going to be deployment date is going to be this clock. UTC now. Deployed by is going to be whatever we pass in here. And what else? We want to also set the IDs here, so deployment target here is going to be deployment target. We don't need to set IDs, I think. We just set the entities instead. Registered model is going to be registered model. And I think that should be all we need on that set. And then we'll add it to database. And this we need to add, so we need to set, we need to create a context for this. So that's going to be here. So db set deployments. So we need to wire this up real quick here. Deployments. Okay. Go ahead and add this to our actual context, right? Public deployment. We'll copy this, make sure it uses the documentation for the interface. Okay, and now we need to set up this deployment entity. I don't think it needs to do much else. Okay, let's see, do we need anything else here? I think for our, in general, we won't set up the entity. We do want to do some stuff here. Sorry for babbling here. We want to do some stuff here, and what we want to do here is set up the relationships here. We probably want to start refactoring it out to separate places soon, but that's okay. So we do have one register model, but if we remove a deployment by any reason, we don't want that to, well, many, deployments, that's fine. On delete, delete behavior, restrict. So if you delete deployment, we don't want to delete the register model, for example. That's kind of what I'm saying here. And the same thing we want for deployment target here. So one deployment target can have many deployments, but we don't want them to delete each other. That's all good. But in here now, what we want to do is we want to add deployments here as a list. So public list deployments, right? And we'll get that settled in a bit. But first we'll do that. We can at least see what kind of deployments we have on deployment targets. Perfect. Okay, then finally what we want to do is wire wrap which table these go to before we get that all settled, and that's going to be in our entity configuration, and we want to do that here. Deployment. It's going to go to the deployment table. And for our Cosmos implementation. Let's see if we can find that. I think we probably have it open somewhere here. Wow. We have a lot of classes now. Here it is. Perfect. Alright, let's go back to the deployment repository here and get this last piece settled out here for this scenario. So deployment, add, deployment, right? Good. And while we do that, we also want to get deployment targets here. We do want to make sure we add the deployments we set. Actually, we don't care about that right now. Let's leave that empty. Okay, so that's creating a deployment sync. Pretty simple, and we'll need another method for adding for getting these deployments, I think. Just so we can do some unit testing on that. Or do we care? Do we want to get deployments? Not right now. All right, good. So what we're gonna do now is add some integration tests for this specific part here. And that should be pretty quick because we did that earlier. And then after that, we'll look at the copying part of this deployment. So in the deployment catalog here, test here, we want to add a method for setting this. So we'll go ahead and say, okay, public sync. Let's see, task, create deployment. We'll say creates deployment. We'll do should instead. Alright. Hopefully that sounds good for you all. So let's go ahead and fix this up. Arrange, act, search. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated to set up. And that is because what we'll do here is, if you just look at the method here, is create deployment, or it's called deploy, model async, yeah. And we need to pass in a deployment target as well as a register model, and they need to be created first. So it's going to be quite a bit of piping here to get that. So for example, if we do we have access to the context or not? Let's see. I don't know if we do, but I want to check. Actually, let's go ahead and add this here over here. Okay, we only have access to this one. Okay, that's fair. But I do think in our SQL Server here we have these. We should have access to something else. Nope. Okay, that is fun. That means we need to do some other stuff here, but that's okay. So what do we need to do here? We need to set up everything as we would have done recently. So that would mean we need an experiment. And actually we need to run here, so experiment, and let's copy paste some stuff here from our lifecycle stuff to get this a bit quicker. So we need at least this from here to create an experiment, and then we need this to create a deployment target. That's easy, but how do we do the model here? Well, we need to do models. We can go to the model catalog repository test here. Model catalog test, I guess that's where we want to go. Register model. Okay, so here actually is all we need to do for model registration. I think there's a simpler one up here somewhere. Register model. What is this one doing here? Okay. An artifact, okay. I see, okay, so we need to create all this stuff here. let's do it. Let's do it. Register model, okay. So that should be good. It's a lot of work here to do this, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and put a separate method here in case we need it later. So we'll do private registered model create registered model. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do all this stuff. And then what we're going to do is return get, and it's going to be under model, I think. Get register model, experiment ID, async task, and why are you complaining? Oh, it's because we have multiple, that makes sense. Let's just do this one instead. I like that method. Glad I added that 6 days ago. Okay. So this is gonna do registered model here, create registered model. And then we can do the same thing but for our deployment target here. So we'll do deployment target, create deployment target, and it's going to do very similar stuff but not really. And then it's going to return deployment get deployment targets first because we want to have one, right? That makes this test a bit easier to read, which is kind of good. Targets. Alright, perfect. So let's see. So we do this now. We're going to say that, okay, well, go ahead and do this. Here's my deployment targets. Here's my registered model. And it is by me that it's registered. Okay, so we're gonna weight these of course as well to make sure they work. So now we come to the assert part here. So we need to be able to assert that we've actually created the deployment target, right? So we need to actually also be able to fetch this. So didn't really want to do it from the beginning, but that makes sense now. So we need to do public deployments, I think makes sense here. Let's make that a list. Get deployments. And I think it makes sense to do it by experiments, because this is actually experiment specific. So we'll do it as a GUID experiment ID. It probably also makes sense. So that's like the horizontal. Then we may also want to do it by deployment targets, honestly. But let's go ahead and first do this. I think we need to have two methods here for deployment. Model sync here. We'll add one first for our experiments. And if I do that, I probably want to have a new ID on my deployment, which makes sense, I think. Alright, so I'll go back to what I wanted to do before, which is going to be list deployments, create deployment, get deployments, GUID experiment ID. Alright, so by doing that, I'm telling myself more or less that I also want experiment ID on deployment, because that'll be easier to just fetch it by that. Because the registered model here, actually has experiment ID on it, so that's fine. We can keep it pretty simple then. It's not too far away from us, if that makes sense. So what we'll do is return DB deployments, where there, registered model, experiment. Oh, we can't do joins. Okay. Yeah, we probably want that because we can't do joins because we're using Cosmos DB. So if we want to be able to do this, the easiest is to do it either in 2 calls or put experiment ID on our deployment. I think we'll just go ahead and put it here. It's fine. Experiment. And I don't really want the property more than this, so registered model, experiment ID. Go ahead and add this property. Slowly little by little, right? We're adding stuff, and it may seem tedious, but it's important, I think, for me at least, to get this somewhat right in the beginning here. Experiments. Experiments. And I also want to add this to our property here, so let's go ahead and add that. That's good. We just do this. By doing that, we can do this. Experiment ID matches ID. Okay. And we'll just go ahead and do that. I'm trying to remember all the steps I need to do here because there's some couple of things I want to do if I do this. And I don't want to forget them, but I also want to make sure we wire this up first. Experiment ID. Okay. Alright, so we need to go into the MLOps DB context, I think it's called. And right here, we also need to specify our relationship with our experiment. And almost makes sense even to start creating entity maps here for all these things, but I'm going to try to avoid that for a little bit more. But probably next stream we'll do that, or before I'll split this up. Okay, good. Let's go back to our tests here. So now we should be able to get that deployment, get deployment, and we should be able to get that from registered model, experiment ID. Like that, and we'll just say the first one because we only have one we care about here. Alright, so deployment here, what we say is that registered model we could probably populate all these things as well if we care about deployment. Care about what it is. I don't think we care about that, so we'll just do ID for now. Actually, we probably care about this. Who am I kidding? We should at least get these last things here. And we should also probably implement this method here as well. Return this deployment repository. Get deployment. So what I was saying here is that we probably need to populate each of these as well here with the appropriate informations. So what we're going to do here is we're going to loop this over. So we'll do deployments for each. And we'll say, okay, X. Deployment. Name is a bit better. Register model. It's going to be DB. Register models. First or default. Well, it's going to be first because we should have one. Register model ID equals deployment. Register model ID. Okay. And similarly, we need to fetch everything else. And I'm only doing one layer down for now, but that's maybe something we need to fix a bit later. So let's fetch the experiments, and let's go ahead and fetch the deployment. Do we care about... don't know if we care about the deployment target here. Maybe. Deployment targets, we don't care about that. Okay. So I'm gonna skip that, but I do care about this. So register model should be not be null, because we should actually have one. And for experiments, same thing, and then we have to just make sure our IDs match here as well. Should be register model ID, and we also want to check some other stuff here, like registered by, registered deployed by should be by me, right? And then the date as well. Date should be today. Date, time, now, date. Okay, so that's good. I think that's kind of what I wanted for this specific one. Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to change that screen. Alright, okay, let's go ahead and clean up my database and let's run that and see if that's going to work. Or if we have something else we need to add here as well. I think that's a good start. What do y'all think? Any thoughts and ideas? Anything you would do differently? Change up? Let's go ahead and build this. Need to add some other unit tests and stuff as well here. 2 days. I think in general it looks pretty good, but we'll see. Okay, we have one build area here. And it's just this one. Okay. Let's do one more time here. Hopefully this looks good. Okay, so let's go ahead and run these tests now. There should be a couple here. Let's just run all these tests here. Alright, so they don't pass, but they all fail, which is interesting. So what is going on here? Let's see. They're all failing. It's probably because of some wire up somewhere. Initialize method. Okay. So what we're saying here is that we have something configured wrong here. That's okay. Let's go ahead and look at exactly what text is. So both relationship between deployment target and deployment targets. And deployment target. Okay, so we have an issue with our entities some way. And the issue is probably this one right here that we added. So deployment target now has deployments, right? And we need to specify that in our DB context here. So let's see, deployment target need to be specified. So we probably can do that here. And we'll say that we have many. Deployment target has many deployments with one deployment target. Okay, that should be okay. If we remove a deployment target, that's fine. And I think on delete we actually want to remove this. So in this case we want to cascade delete here, because if you do remove deployment targets, we probably want to remove all the deployments part of that as well. That would make sense to me. And let's see, did we create a database or did we not create a database here? Okay, we did not because we failed. Let's try to run these again and see if they pass this time. Maybe not. Come on. You are thinking too much, please. Okay, let's run these. And see if they work. Ugh, come on. Be nice to me today. Okay, so we have some convention issue here. Okay, do I need to specify a key here maybe? That's probably what I need to do. As one target. Okay, so I have specified this already here. That's one main deployment. Okay. Swan deployment target. I think in this case actually it's what we want to do for key. Part here. Maybe not up there. Okay. We don't want it here, I think. if this works better. Let's run again. I may have missed something as well. We'll fix this eventually at some point. Just need to figure out exactly how this configuration should be done. Seems better because it's taking a bit longer to create this, so I think that the validation here at least went through. And let's see if that's the case or not. That looks like it's failing. No, passing okay, let's see. Okay, so at least that looks a bit better, but we didn't pass on the actual test we want to pass on, but at least the rest looks good. That's good. Alright, so we have an exception here. We have primary key validation, deployment target, can't start duplicate key in deployment target. Okay, so let's see. So do we clean this up or not between tests? I think that's the issue here. Let's see. So it looks like we're trying to do 2 deployment targets with the same ID here. Why do we do that? What is going on here? Let's look at that. So here's creating deployment target, right? And we do that here. And it should give you a new ID. And register model, I don't think it's doing anything else. Okay, so what is going on here? It's because we are referencing not by ID, I think. Okay, let's change. I think it has to do with this actually. So let's change this ID, so that's okay. I'm okay with that. This is why we do tests, to make sure we find these before it's deployed. Okay. Let's try this again. See if this works. We'll just run this test, I think it should be enough to see if this is an issue or not. Hopefully this is going to pass. Looks good. Okay, so that was the issue. We have to reference IDs instead. Okay, perfect. Alright, so we're almost done with this specific section here, but I do want to get some other stuff here. So one thing we did is that we added this list on deployment targets of deployments. So it'd be really cool to make sure we check that we actually add that as well here. So I think that would be cool to do, and I think it would make sense to have that as well populated. No. I don't think so actually. That's fine, because it depends on how we're going to use this, but for now I think that's fine. I think it would be cool as well though to have deployments by deployment target here. Let's keep it simple, I guess. Simple for now is the best course of action. But let's add a unit test for the time, and then I think that's good, and we'll continue onwards from there. So repository, let's go ahead and see that. So we had this deployment repository test here. We can have a similar method for this, but it's going to be for the deployed time. So create deployment. It's called create deployment. Yep. Should set deployed date. Right. So if you do this, create deployment async and pass in, doesn't really matter too much honestly, new deployment target, We probably need to keep this separate, we'll see. New registered model. And me by me. If we do that, we can then fetch these deployments. And the time here should be properly set. Deployed. Deployment date here should be now. Okay. I think it may fail because of null ref exceptions here, so let's go and check why that will be before we do that. Actually, that should be fine. That should be fine. That should be good actually. We may have some other constraints here, but let's run this test. Make sure they run. And we'll open a PR for this for work in progress and look at the rest if we have time. It's almost lunchtime here. We'll see if we continue this. But let's go ahead and run this first. Okay, that worked. Let's go ahead and add a PR for these changes at least, so we got something up and running. And we're gonna have to get an issue for this, and I think we have an issue for it already. Deployment, it's gonna be issue 149 here. So we'll go ahead and add that. New branch, issue 149. We're gonna create it from issue 148 because we need that deployment target already. That we done before. Bring my changes over. Make sure we're checking everything here. So we have that. Got some stuff going here. Okay, so we added support here for an deployment entity. So we haven't deployed anything yet, right? But we have at least added the support for deployment entity. And the next thing is going to be to actually copy this file over to a proper place, and then in some way figure out how to return the URI for that. It's going to be interesting to see. I feel like it's still something we are missing. We are missing puzzle piece here for deployment targets, and a little bit concerned about that thought. But we think of that separately, I think. Yep. Adding. Okay. 149. Here is that we have to think about is, okay, so let's take a moment to think about how it's going to work here. The only thing we're missing, well, we're missing quite a bit still, but one of the things we're missing is like, how do we know what the URI is for where we're going to deploy it to? Is that going to be on the deployment targets, or is that going to be returned when we deploy it? And the more I think about it, the more I feel like it should be on the deployment target as a property, which is going to be the path to the file almost. But then if we do that, it's going to be specific to an experiment and even to a model actually, which is maybe not what we want to do. I was thinking we can have maybe that's why I did deployment environment before. Let me look here. Deployment environment, deployment targets. No, I think they don't need that still. That's still obsolete. But yeah, let's think of that a bit, I think. But I think we're in otherwise pretty good shape here. I think the next thing we want to do here is go ahead and deploy this as well. And if we look at the next step here, the next step here is to go ahead and add this copying of this deployment to a new container. And the question I'm asking right now is, okay, how can we expose that in a good way, and how can we make it visible for a user where we have deployed it to? Which is either by returning the URI to that here, but we don't want the URI to change every time we raise a new model, because they're going to be the same name, right? It's just going to, I think, overwrite the existing model there in some way or another. So for example, if we have a test environment, and we deploy a new environment to it, we should then overwrite whatever we have there directly. I think that makes most sense. So we need to figure out how to get that URI properly set up. But I think for now, this is a good stopping point for the stream, and we'll think about how we'll do that going forward. But in the next stream, or in this week coming up, we'll look at how we can actually copy this container over, create a new container, and manage all that fun stuff there. But for now, thank you very much for joining into today's stream. I always had a good time as always. It's been fun hanging out with you, and we've done some good progress here on this deployment scenarios. We need just to figure out some of the details here and there, and I would very much appreciate if you come with suggestions on the PRs, especially you, Brett, and Daniel, and Luis, anyone watching, AJ and Mitch. Think about how you want to have this URI presented, and think about if you want to get that part of your deployment target, or part of the deployment, or something else completely different. And that'd be awesome. But thank you very much for today's stream. I will catch you at the next one. Have a great weekend and a great week, guys. Thank you.